most amazing artist. I hope you are having an awesome day today. Welcome to a brand new project, and yes, this project is all about clay. So before we begin, let's go over the things that you're going to need. You will need some clay, and over here in my little doggy bowl I have some plain old water, and I have some slip, which is a combination of clay and water. This is going to be our glue when we want to attach pieces to our project, and I'll show you how to use that in a little bit. I have a popsicle stick to cut. I have a toothpick here to draw, and I have a straw that I've just cut the end off because we're going to be poking holes in the bottom of our paintbrush, and you'll see why a little bit later. I also have this cylindrical piece of wood because we are going to be using this as our rolling pin to roll our clay out in just a little bit. I also have a paintbrush template here. This is going to help you create the shape of our paintbrush in a little bit. And underneath everything, I have a piece of canvas because this clay will definitely stick to your table. So just make sure you keep your clay on your canvas. And you may have guessed by the title or by this and me talking about a paintbrush, we are going to be making clay paintbrushes. After we fire them, we will paint them, and then on the end, we are going to attach some yarn so it looks like paint is actually flowing from our paintbrush. It's gonna be really, really cool. But today, we have to actually make the paintbrush itself. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to flatten out my clay. The amount of clay that I had prepared is a little bit too much, I think. So I just took off a section, and we need a size ball of clay that fits in our hand nicely. And what I'm doing is I'm just warming up my clay. If it's a little bit dry, you can dip your fingers in the water and start to add more water a little bit at a time. At no point should you ever put your clay into the water. That's what our fingers are for. You can just dip your fingers in the water and kind of make your clay a little bit easier to work with. So I am just making sure it's not too dry, and this clay feels awesome. I think it's definitely ready to be made into something. So I'm gonna start making a giant ball or a giant sphere with my hands by just rolling it in between my hands. And once we have a sphere, I'm gonna take this part of my hand, the bottom part of my thumb, and I'm gonna start pushing or hitting this clay down onto my table. And this is probably shaking my camera, but I'm not hitting it too hard, just hard enough to have it start to flatten out a little bit. Now we are ready to take our rolling pin, and you can stand up for this part if you want to. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to get an even thickness if you stand up and roll out your clay. But what I'm doing is I'm just going back and forth. I'm not staying in the same area for too long, because if you stay in the same area for too long, then your clay will get very thin in that section, and we want this to be an even thinness. So every now and again you want to pick it up and move it around so that we get an even thickness. And what I mean by that is that we have a slab here that is not thin in some areas and not thick in some areas. We want it to be the same thickness all the way around to the best of our ability. So I've noticed it's a little bit thick over in this section, so I'm going to take my rolling pin and I'm going to roll it out a little bit. We need to roll this out to where our paintbrush will fit onto it. So if you start rolling and you notice that it's way too thin, then we might need to add a little bit of clay to this and try again, because we don't want it to be too thin to where after we fire it in the kiln, it kind of just is so fragile that it will break. We want it to be a good thickness, not too thin, not too thick. You know what? I think I'm gonna have to add some more clay to this because this looks a little bit too thin, too skinny around the edges. So I'm going to try again, and I'm just gonna add a little bit more clay. So what I'm gonna do is I'll add more clay to this, roll it into a ball. Make sure it's not dry. I can add a little bit of water at a time if I need to. And then I'm going to squish it down with this part of my hand, and I will start rolling it, trying to get it at an even thickness until it is big enough for me to fit this paintbrush on it. And then I will show you the next step in just a minute. I just rolled out my clay to the size of my template, and it fits perfectly on this amount of clay. And I want to show you the thickness of it because we don't want it to be too thin We don't want it to be too thick either, because actually whenever we fire these in the kiln, they will shrink a little bit. So just be mindful of that. I have it about 1/2 inch thick all the way around, and I try to make it very even across the top. Then I'm going to place my template on top, and this is where our toothpick comes in handy, because I am going to trace this template onto my clay. I'm not drawing all the way through my clay. I'm just drawing a line into my clay all the way around. One hand is holding my template down, the other hand is tracing. And when we lift it off, there is the shape of our paintbrush, nice and outlined. And I'm going to take my popsicle stick and I'm going to go straight up and down to cut along this line. So I am just pressing into my clay and cutting around where I have traced that paintbrush. Every now and again, if you find this a little bit hard, you can go off the side, cut off that extra bit of clay to get it out of your way. And I'm going to go all the way around my paintbrush. Don't do this too quickly because we want the shape to be nice and precise. So I'm going pretty slow all the way around, and I'm just setting my extra clay off to the side here because we are going to use that in a little bit to add some details to our paintbrush. And there we go. There's the shape of my paintbrush done. We have to be super gentle with it at this point because it is very wet and it will not hold its shape if you mess with it too much. So just be careful at this stage. But I've noticed there are some like raggedy edges around my paintbrush where I cut. So I'm gonna dip my finger in the water and I'm just gonna run my finger along those edges to smooth them out. If we fire this paintbrush with those very harsh edges, then it's gonna be very sharp whenever we fire it in the kiln. We don't want our paintbrush to be sharp. We want it to be nice and smooth. So I'm just dipping my finger in the water and I'm going around the edges to smooth them out. On this template, there is also a hole cut out of the handle on your paintbrush. So after you smooth out those edges, we can use our template again, use a toothpick, and I'm going to trace that small hole. And this is a very small section, so we can't use our popsicle stick to cut it out. So I'm just going to use my toothpick and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go all the way through to my table and cut out this circle very gently. And once you go all the way around, you can use your toothpick to kind of pull it out of place. And there is the hole in my handle, and look again, those edges are very sharp. So I'm going to take a little bit of water in my finger and just smooth out those edges. And now I'm going to use my toothpick to kind of draw some details into my paintbrush, because while it does have a very nice shape right now, I want to be able to tell where my paintbrush starts, the wooden part of my paintbrush is, and where the bristles of my paintbrush are, because paintbrush has three main parts. It has the wooden part down at the bottom on the handle. It has a metal part that holds the third part, which is the bristles on our paintbrush in place. So I'm going to use my toothpick and I'm just going to start drawing some horizontal lines across my paintbrush. And this section here is going to be the bristles on my paintbrush. So maybe you want to add some texture into your paintbrush by just using your toothpick and drawing some lines in there. I definitely think that's a good idea so that we can tell that this paintbrush has some wonderful texture. Clay is awesome with texture. It captures texture beautifully. So use your tools today and add those textures to your paintbrush. Right now I'm just doing random vertical-ish lines, vertical-ish because some are a little bit diagonal. And I'm not cutting through my paintbrush, I'm just drawing these lines right here. Now I need to draw the metal part. So underneath this horizontal line that I drew, I'm going to skip a little bit of space and I'm going to draw another horizontal line, and that's going to be the metal section. And if you want, you can add some like hardware pieces on there, just some easy circles if you'd like to. So to do that, I'm just going to take a little piece of clay, make a sphere, and after you have a sphere, what I'm going to do is put it down on my table. I'm going to take my finger, I'm going to squish it down a little bit, and that makes a little piece of hardware that we can add to our paintbrush. If you want to attach things to your clay, that's where this slip comes in handy. We have to do something called scratching and slipping, which means we are going to scratch into the clay, and we're going to use the top of our toothbrush to do that. Scratch into this clay. You want to scratch it hard enough to where you can see lines in there. And I can see lines in there, and you're going to scratch where you want to attach something, and then we are going to attach it right where we want it. Okay, and I'm going to do a little wiggle to make sure all those crevices inside of my clay where I scratched are getting some wetness in there, and that is acting as the glue while we attach pieces. So that looks really cool, but I feel like it's a little bit heavy on this side, so I'm going to balance it out, and I'm going to add 2 more circles or pieces of hardware to my paintbrush, and I'll be right back to show you the next step. Alright, I just finished adding the hardware, or the 3 circles, to the metal section of my paintbrush, or the hardware section, and I noticed my circles kind of got bigger as I went along, and that one's pretty big, but I'm not too worried about it because all of our paintbrushes are going to be unique and different, and I guess that's what makes mine different than everyone else's. Underneath this horizontal line, I'm going to draw 1 more horizontal line. And then I'm going to just draw some diagonal lines in there just to add a couple more details to the metal or the silver section of my paintbrush. And now I'm on to the wooden section, and we can add some more lines to look like a wood grain texture, and those would just be some curved lines here and there, some long, some short, and all the way up at the top too. We don't want to do too many because we don't want people to be confused that this section is bristles like our first section is. We want them to look different. So I'm just going to use some long curvy lines to make it look like a wood texture. Okay, and that is pretty much my basic paintbrush done. We are going to poke some holes up here at the top where our bristles are, because like I said earlier, we're going to be tying yarn to this to make it look like the paint is flowing off of our paintbrush, and it's going to look beautiful. So I'm going to take my straw, but I'm going to cut some holes up here, and then I'm going to do that by just pressing my straw in, and it creates a hole. And if that clay sticks in there, you can kind of just squeeze it out, put it with the rest of your clay. And we don't want to do this right on the top edge. We want to come down a little bit onto our bristles. If we do it right on the top edge, then this section of our paintbrush will be pretty fragile. So just go at the top of your paintbrush where your bristles are, come in a little bit, and then poke your holes. All right, and it looks like I had enough room for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 holes at the top of my paintbrush where I'm going to tie some yarn on later. After you're done with your paintbrush, you've added all the texture you wanted, you have attached any other details that you want to your paintbrush, we are going to carefully transfer this to a paper plate that has our name on the back. So you'll grab a paper plate and you'll write your name on the back, and then we will carefully pick up our paintbrush and lay him onto our paper plate. And now he is ready to start drying. It takes about 2 weeks for these to dry 100%, and then Miss Em is going to fire them in the kiln, and then they will be ready to paint. So I hope you guys have a lot of fun creating these really cool clay paintbrushes. I can't wait to see how your paintbrush turns out. I know it's going to be amazing because you guys are amazing. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Bye guys.